Okay, sorry. Welcome everyone to this session on language development, and I just want to apologize for these teething issues. I'm really sorry, and hopefully by the next session we'll have resolved the issues. Just very quickly, well, first of all, I'm really I'm glad to be inviting the presenters to this exciting session, and we're really looking forward to four very exciting presentations on language development. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Each speaker has 15 minutes per presentation. I will issue a 5-minute and a 1-minute warning. I hope that's okay. I don't want to be too interventionist, but it's important to keep to time. And then we've got 10 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. So I do encourage everyone watching online as well as here in the audience to ask questions. Unfortunately, we might not be able to cover all questions, but please do ask. On that note, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Rachel Scott from the Bell Foundation, whose presentation is titled Language and Learning Loss, the Evidence of Pupils Who Use English as an Additional Language. Rachel, thanks a lot for coming, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Oh. Are we good? It's a little bit echoey. I apologize to those in the room because this was a very visual presentation, so there might be things that you sort of miss out on, but hopefully you can catch up when you get the presentation afterwards. So my name's Rachel and I'm from the Bell Foundation, and we are a charitable foundation that focuses on improving outcomes for people who use English as an additional language. I'm going to begin by giving you a bit of context about EAL pupils and the policy that is around them at the moment before I move on to the impact of the school closures for this group. So there are 1.6 million children with EAL in the country at the moment, which is approximately 20% of the entire school population. It is still too early to know the impact of a sort of post-Brexit immigration system on the characteristics and numbers of arriving families. However, we know that we've already got this significant portion of students already, and we are seeing lots of arrivals currently from Afghanistan and Syria, Hong Kong, and of course, most recently, the Ukraine. So the first thing that is really important to know about this group is that they shouldn't really be thought of as one group. The EAL label in England is an incredibly broad label. So that's used to categorize a pupil who has just arrived, who's had a highly disrupted education, speaks no English whatsoever, but it's also the same label that we give to a sort of very privileged child who comes from a multinational family and speaks English fluently, but as an additional language to a number of other languages in their families. So that's one thing to bear in mind when looking at research in this field, is thinking through how broad that label is and have they broken it down in any way. So research that my foundation has funded has clearly evidenced the particular need and the sort of vulnerability and the risk to attainment for pupils who have very low proficiency in English. And the impact of having low proficiency is extremely significant, much more so than the sort of factors that we commonly associate with risk, such as gender or free school meal status or ethnicity. It's also important to note the duration of that low proficiency stage. I think sometimes people think, oh, well, you know, they arrive in school, give them a few years, they'll catch up, it'll be fine. But actually, we know that it takes about 7 years or more for a pupil who's arrived as new to English to reach a level of competency in English that lets them sort of access the curriculum. So this is a group that we are really interested in as a foundation, and that's what my research focused on. And in terms of numbers, that's over 600,000 pupils who fall into that category of still needing to develop language in order to fully access the curriculum. If you had visuals right now, you'd see lovely graphics showing you just how big that gap is. So essentially, both at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4, the data is really clear. If you are new to English through to developing competency, you will be performing significantly below the national average. You've got to reach competency to sort of even begin to level out. And again, just to remind you, over 600,000 pupils. So despite this very clear need, policy to support these pupils has been systematically dismantled, I would say, over the last decade. From the removal of the ethnic minority achievement grants in 2011, we had a brief uptick in 2016 when they introduced statutory assessment of proficiency. That was removed 2 years later. It's all been downhill since. The access arrangements for exams for this group were sort of drastically reduced in 2017. And in 2019, it's a dreadful year. The framework for initial teacher training was published, no mention of EAL. The framework for early career teachers and what training they need, no mention of EAL. And to top it all off, Ofsted removed all mention of this group from their handbooks. So it's a really hostile environment in terms of policy for EAL pupils at the moment. But I did just want to shout out to Ofqual, the one government department that does still acknowledge these pupils. Okay, so when the pandemic struck and school was cancelled, we were very concerned about what impact that would have on these pupils who are still acquiring English, because as well as missing all the subject learning, they were also going to be missing the opportunity to be developing and learning their language. And if they had lost language, then that would then have another impact onto their subject learning, because it's even longer before they can access the curriculum. And we have a sort of network of schools across the country, and we were hearing that from teachers on the ground, that they were seeing this negative impact. But we wanted to have some evidence to help try and persuade policymakers to think about this group when they were doing all those catch-up plans that I'm sure you can all remember. But it is an incredibly challenging group to study, because we've got no statutory assessment of proficiency in England anymore, which means there is no way to identify in a data set the pupils who are in need from those who are more privileged. Like the rest of the country, there was no baseline assessment data from the start of the pandemic. At that point in time, there wasn't much assessment data as schools were reopening. And we were doing this at the point where we were kind of coming in and out of lockdowns. So it was sort of a rapidly changing landscape. So what we decided to do was commission some questions from the Teacher Omnibus survey in spring 2021. And then we wanted to try and analyse and publish the findings quickly enough to influence those teachers and school leaders and policymakers. So we got the raw data in late April, and I think we published early June. So it was an incredibly sort of rapid turnaround survey. So the survey was administered in March. So that was just after schools reopened, after the second period of closures. So the observations that the teachers made were drawing on both from the first period of closures and the second period of closures. The responses were analysed by school phase, they were analysed by geographic region, and the responses to the open-ended questions that we asked were sort of thematically analysed to draw out the common themes. And some of those were the impact on confidence, the role of family or caregivers, the challenges of remote learning, and the role of peers. So our evidence very clearly demonstrated that the pandemic did have an additional impact on these pupils. So in addition to the subject learning loss that all pupils faced, they also had language learning loss, and some even had sort of a regression in their language skills. So we found that about 3/4 of primary school teachers observed a loss in their EAL pupils in at least one or more of the language skill areas. So that's either reading, writing, speaking, or listening. And about 60% of secondary school teachers reported the same thing. So to go into the findings a little bit, I think the impact of family is a really, really key finding. Amongst primary school teachers, 25% cited the barriers that the families had in supporting the learning as being a major impact of loss for that pupil. Amongst secondary teachers, that drops to about 9%, which I think is because, you know, secondary pupils learn more independently. They weren't as dependent on their families for support as the primary school phase. But across both phases, it's important to note that it was the proficiency in English of those families that was perceived to have that marked impact for the child. And the findings sort of suggest that parents were considered like in loco teachers during the pandemic, and the sort of expectation was that they would bridge that language gap in the way that teachers and teaching assistants would normally do in the classroom. But of course, you know, teachers are proficient in English and they are proficient in pedagogy. And when you're asking a parent who is new to English or still acquiring English to sort of mediate a curriculum that's all being delivered through English, that's a really sort of Herculean task. Sadly, some of the responses did reveal some very problematic views in a minority of teachers regarding EAL families during the pandemic. I think a majority seemed really sympathetic and were very conscious of the fact that all of the support was being delivered in English, even things like BBC Bite Size or Oak Academy, that was all in English. But I think there was a minority who was sort of explicitly hostile towards these families, and they would say that it was their attitudes towards education that was causing the problem, and they sort of didn't acknowledge that these families did not have the same kind of support or resources that all the other families did. A second finding that's worth noting is the challenges of remote learning with this cohort. So 1 in 12 teachers reported that pupils who use EAL were explicitly disadvantaged through online learning compared to their English-speaking peers. In fact, out of all respondents, and if you'd have seen the slide, you'd have known that was 1,535 teachers, only 3 of them actually thought that online learning provided some sort of advantage through access to translations or being able to pause and rewind videos. But on the whole, tech wasn't quite there. In terms of well-being, the final sort of finding I wanted to flag was the impact of COVID on their confidence. So the sort of emotional and social impact was quite devastating. So all children suffered from the social isolation of the pandemic, but for EAL pupils, they lost language and then lost confidence to speak to their peers even when the world reopened. And so we found that 1 in 5 secondary school teachers reported that the pupils no longer had confidence to speak to their peers when they returned to school, and 1 in 6 primary school teachers said the same thing. So what can we learn from this, and what do we need to do next? I think the first thing is that statutory assessment is crucial. We were not even really able to accurately measure the impact of the pandemic on this cohort, the sort of low proficiency pupils, because there's no way to identify them. We know they're super at risk, and yet they're totally invisible in data sets like the NPD, and they get hidden by their fluent plurilingual peers. I think a second important thing is that with the acceleration of digital learning, and particularly the move to digital assessment that we're seeing, we need to explore how tech can, at the very least, be equitable for this group. But I think it could actually perhaps begin to level the playing field if we really try. So a sort of wholly digitalized assessment system could even enable a pupil to demonstrate their knowledge in their first language. It sounds a bit radical, but that concept is already happening in the States, where there's a number of places where you can sit your exams in your home language. Another recommendation, teachers need training. There's a sort of rapid disappearance of expertise in the system since the removal of the funding 10 years ago. So we really need to sort of address that. I think it's interesting when people talk about every pupil mattering in the system, because there's 20% of pupils that are being completely ignored in policy. The value of their home language was a real missed opportunity in the pandemic. It could have been fantastic if we'd have really embraced that when parents were doing all that teaching. But as a country, we're still thinking that their first language is a hindrance. I attended a roundtable at Manchester Met recently with their My Create project, and they reported nearly 15% of pupils saying that they were forbidden to use their home language even in the playground. So, a lot of work needs doing there. And I think finally, we need awareness of the sort of different impact the pandemic has had on social isolation for this group. Again, just thinking about how they had that added layer, how that's going to impact over time is unknown, but something that anybody in this field should be aware of. I've got a lovely slide then, which had links to other research done by other groups in this area. So please do check them out when you get your copy of the slides. Thank you. Okay, and I mute at this point.
Thanks a lot, Rachel, for this really interesting presentation. And again, apologies for the technical error. Also, apologies to the audience online, because I don't think they were able to see the presentation. So, can I just make sure that the next speakers that you share your slides just for the audience online, and we'll make sure that everybody, if they want to, can get some of the slides sent to them. Thanks a lot, Rachel. So I'll invite our next speaker, Helena. Helena Takala is a senior researcher at NatCen Social Research. So she's one of our own, and NatCen will be talking about the REAL program. The presentation is titled Evaluation of the REAL program, a program for improving the home learning environment in disadvantaged areas. Helena, over to you.
Hi everyone online, hi everyone in the room. I also have lots of really fun slides, so sorry that people in the room can't see them, but you'll get access to them afterwards, I'm sure. And I hope that everyone online can see these slides though. So I'm Helena, I'm a senior researcher here at NatCen in the Children and Families team, our Centre for Children and Families, and I'll be presenting on the REAL programme that we evaluated recently. Sorry, yes, I will. So today I'll just be taking you through a bit of contextual information about what is a home learning environment, and then I'll give you a bit of background information about the intervention that we evaluated and our evaluation as well, and tell you a bit about the design, and unfortunately also how it was disrupted quite significantly by COVID-19. And then I'll highlight some interesting findings on perceived outcomes and families that came out of this evaluation. And then I'll leave you with some takeaway thoughts and information about where to find out more about this research. So what is a home learning environment? So it encompasses both the physical characteristics of the home and also the activities that parents can do with their children in the home to support their learning. So in terms of physical characteristics, we're talking about things like having access to resources like pens, papers, books, having access to a quiet space to study, having access to outdoor space, having access to the internet. And in terms of activities, it could be parents reading to their children, reciting nursery rhymes, drawing with their children. And the home learning environment is really important. And there's a lot of existing evidence that shows that it can have really powerful long-term positive impacts on children's academic achievement and their cognitive and socio-emotional outcomes. And I've cited some papers here on the slide, and some of them have actually found that it's as important, can be as important a factor as socioeconomic factors in determining and shaping child outcomes. And just to give a bit of background about the evaluation that we did, so because of this strong evidence base, the Department of Education has been interested in home learning environments for quite a few years. And in 2017, they announced this funding to find out what works in improving home learning environments in the north of England. And the Education Endowment Foundation then selected some promising interventions to trial. And one of this was the REAL programme, which is an early language intervention. And the National Children's Bureau delivered the REAL programme in the northwest of England from January 2020, although again, it had quite significant COVID-related adjustments at the time. But REAL was delivered in relatively disadvantaged areas. So settings were selected based on whether they were in an area of relative deprivation, and also if they had weaker earliest foundation stage results for early language. And the children, again, in the settings, they were selected based on whether the practitioners thought they had some additional early language needs. So it had a focus on disadvantage from the start. And we here at NatCen evaluated the REAL programme, and the evaluation finished last July. And the REAL intervention itself, just to say a few words about that. So REAL stands for Raising Early Achievement in Literacy. And it was developed in the 1990s by academics at the University of Sheffield, so Professors Pete Hannon and Kathy Nutt-Brown. And the programme aims to improve the home learning environment for children in terms of the early literacy development. And it does so by getting practitioners, so earliest practitioners, to work with parents. So they actually go into the home, work one-to-one with parents to improve their confidence and their knowledge about early language and also about home learning generally. And there's been a few iterations of the REAL programme, but the one that we evaluated, it involved training, some literacy events with parents in the local area. And the key activity is the home visits. So this is where practitioners actually go into families' homes 8 to 10 times during the delivery period, and they have a conversation with the parent about their child's early language development. They model some activities that the parents can do with their child at home, and also leave them with some resources. There's quite a direct, obviously, way of influencing and improving the home learning environment. And I have here on the slide this ORIM framework, which is really key to the REAL programme. And it's just one that the practitioners get taught how to use in the training, and that they use to plan for all the home visits that they do with families. But it just explains or shows that their families can provide the children opportunities to do and resources to develop their language skills. They can recognise their children's early literacy achievements. They can provide high quality interactions with their children around early literacy activities, and parents can also model to their children some positive literacy behaviour, they can read and visually engage in literacy activities in front of their child. And that's also something that families can provide in terms of the home learning environment. Sorry that this doesn't really translate well to the people in the room, but obviously explaining a framework that the practitioners use to do the home visits. In terms of our evaluation, so we had planned to do an impact evaluation, so with a randomized control trial, and we've done all the baseline testing, but unfortunately it got cancelled due to COVID-19. But we still did an IPE, so an implementation and process evaluation that included surveys and observations and qualitative interviews with the practitioners and parents who took part in REAL. And the IPE focused on looking at how the REAL programme was delivered, the perceived outcomes for practitioners and parents, and also any kind of lessons for future delivery of the REAL programme. And I alluded to before that the COVID-19 pandemic really affected the delivery of the REAL programme. So delivery actually started in March 2020. So all the practitioners have done 1 or 2 visits to homes, and then everything got paused and the group literacy events were cancelled. And then the REAL programme did resume in September that year, but now the home visits were being done remotely. So instead of practitioners actually going and visiting people in the homes, that was obviously not acceptable anymore with social distancing, they would just drop off resources at the doorstep, or they would share them by post, and then have follow-up discussions with parents on the phone or maybe on Zoom. And overall, we found these remote home visits, they were quite challenging for practitioners to deliver. So around 60% met the requirement of doing 8 to 10 home visits per family, and 40% did not. And the reasons were related to the pandemic. So in terms of practitioners themselves, they had obviously an increased workload because of staff sickness in the setting, and just classroom bubbles opening and closing all the time. So they had less availability to do the REAL programme. but also they found it more challenging to schedule these visits in with families. It was more difficult to maintain the engagement of families remotely, just doing it on Zoom rather than visiting them in person. And families obviously were preoccupied with home learning and kind of concerns about health and lockdowns and all the other COVID-19 factors. But the positive news is we did still find like a lot of positive outcomes from the evaluation, despite the challenges around the remote home visits. So again, sorry that this doesn't translate very well to the room, but on the screen here, I have this graph that shows what we found from the NLine practitioner survey, where we asked them about different areas. So for example, you can see in the graph here that when we asked the practitioners whether the real program improved their knowledge of early literacy development, 86% yes. When we asked them, did you have an improved understanding of children's home learning environments? Again, 85% said yes. So we had really strong results for practitioners. And then when we asked practitioners again about what kind of outcomes they saw for families, you can see in the screen here that the outcomes were pretty good, but they weren't as good as for practitioners. And we asked about this quite a lot in the interviews with practitioners, and they said the main barrier for achieving more with families was the remote delivery. And they said that had the home visits continued to be delivered in person, face to face, we would have seen a lot more strong outcomes for families. But unfortunately, a lot of the magic of the real program was lost when you weren't able to do this kind of face to face interaction with families. And again, this is a program that's been delivered in disadvantaged areas. So the practitioners found that it was they made a lot of progress when they were doing these visits in person compared to remotely. But we still found some interesting findings in terms of the outcomes of families. So just wanted to highlight two areas which I thought would be interesting to share. So one was that we found that the real program improved parents' participation in their children's learning. And the particular ways it did this was that the home visits increased the parents' confidence to do activities in the home. And what was interesting is that the practitioners said there was particularly those parents who weren't highly educated themselves that really benefited from this reassurance from the practitioners that, that you're doing the right thing, just carry on doing what you're doing. And this really improved their confidence. And also what we found was that the home visits increased parents' knowledge about the different home learning activities and how they can engage their child, do different things. And in interviews, parents said to us, before we kind of lacked structure or ideas of what we could do. And now they have this pool of resources and ideas from the practitioner. So they were just much more then motivated to start doing home learning activities. But overall, parents and practitioners agreed that it was a simple and fun home learning activities that were most effective in getting parents involved. And I think we can all relate to that. I'm definitely much more likely to pick up something that's simple and fun than something that's boring and complicated. And it was definitely the case with these parents, who have busy lives or working parents in terms of the real program. And then the second area where we just saw improvements was that the real program increased parents' engagement in early literacy activities in particular. And what we found was that the home visits increased parents' knowledge about how early literacy develops generally. So the practitioners who were going in, they were explaining how early literacy develops in children generally, but also because they were doing much more one-to-one activities with their child during the real program. They also became much more aware of how their own child develops these early literacy skills. And that was something that was got them much more engaged in early literacy activities because they had this additional insight. And overall, in interviews, parents and practitioners told us that it was really effective to root these early literacy activities in everyday family routines. So what the real program a lot of the time was doing was saying to parents, you don't have to come up with creative new things every time. You can be practicing the literacy skills when you're doing the shopping, or you're putting away the groceries, or you're making dinner. And this was a really successful way that the real practitioners were able to engage the parents in early literacy activities. And this was quite a new realization for parents. So in this slide here, I have two quotes from parent interviews. On one of them, the parent had been asked to bake a cake with their child and practice early literacy while reading the recipe and stuff. And then the other quote, the parent had been asked to just look through everything, packages that are in the kitchen cupboards, and was written on them. So in these quotes that I have on the screen, the parents has expressed kind of surprise that you could be learning in this way. You don't have to be doing reading and writing sitting down at a table, you could just incorporate these early literacy activities and everyday family things that we're doing anyway. So just wanted to wrap up with some concluding thoughts. So we obviously don't have impact evaluation results, but I think our evaluation, which focused on surveys and kind of quality findings, still showed this kind of parent-practitioner partnerships can be a really effective way to address and improve the home learning environment. And also, I just want to highlight the findings once again here, that it was the practitioners sharing their knowledge with parents that was really powerful about the real programme, and it was really effective in making parents more confident. And especially it was those parents who were maybe not as highly educated themselves, and they really benefited from this reassurance from practitioners that they were doing the right thing in the home. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight again the fact that it was the fun, simple, everyday things that were the really effective ways to engage parents. And I think there's just something important there for thinking about what kind of programs you want to be developing and delivering with parents, and especially parents in disadvantaged areas. But yeah, so that's all I had time for. But the full evaluation report, if you're interested, will be published next month on the Education Endowment Foundation website. So this was a sneak preview into the evaluation findings. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them at the end of the presentations or by email. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Helena, for this really interesting presentation. In the interest of time, we're going to continue with Dr. Claire Huxley and Olivia Garner from the Institute for Employment Studies. This is very much a hybrid delivery. Claire is joining us online. Claire is a senior research fellow and Olivia is a research officer. So Claire will be delivering the first part of the presentation, and then Olivia will be delivering the second part in person. Over to you, Olivia.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Claire, and I'll be presenting today with my colleague Livy, who's in the room with everyone. Our talk today looks at two interventions delivering continuing professional development to private, voluntary, and independent nurseries in predominantly disadvantaged areas. Excuse me, just changing slide. I'll start talking while we're trying to get there. So we know that language development is important for success in later life, and that social mobility gaps are created early and are harder to rectify as we get older. The period around 2 to 3 years old is a critical stage for language development, and studies demonstrate that high-quality, evidence-based interventions can improve outcomes by up to 6 months progress for language and communication interventions and up to 4 months for literacy interventions. Around 70% of 2 to 4-year-olds in England attend private, voluntary and independent nurseries, or PVIs as we'll refer to these. And a recent study by the Sutton Trust found that in 2017, just under a quarter of children at PVIs went on to be eligible for free school meals. This means that many disadvantaged children are attending it and being supported by PVIs. However, compared to the maintained sector or schools, PVI sectors are less well researched, less well resourced, staff tend to be less qualified, and they have less continuing professional development, or CPD, as we'll refer to this going forward. Okay, so the Cecil study looked at CPD for early years practitioners that was delivered by speech and language therapists in particular, or SALTs as we'll call them. The project was in collaboration with the University of Oxford, who led the impact evaluation aspect of the project, and IES led the implementation and process evaluation, which we'll talk about today. We looked at 2 separate interventions for practitioners who were working with 2-year-olds. These were called the Launchpad for Language and Cecil. This was a small-scale RCT design with one group receiving the training during the 2021 academic year and one group receiving training after this. The Launchpad for Language programme is run by the Children's Integrated Speech and Language Therapy Service for Hackney and the City in London. Each nursery was assigned a link speech and language therapist who visits the setting for half a day per week. At the beginning of the intervention, the nursery lead meets with the speech and language therapist, and they choose from a menu of activities, which includes group activities, such as Alan the Alien, where children help teach vocabulary to Alan, a friendly and curious alien, pictured on the right, if you can see the screen, training and activities for parents, staff training, including options to video staff practice and receive feedback, and direct work with small groups of children. So options were reviewed on a half-termly basis with the speech and language therapist to fit ongoing needs. The intervention is usually delivered face-to-face in the setting, but over the lockdowns, this was adapted to virtual catch-ups or online activity groups via video conferencing software. And the SALTs recorded videos of themselves modeling practice, as they were mostly unable to enter the settings until spring 2021. The Cecil programme in Nottinghamshire is run by the Nottinghamshire Healthcare Children's Centre Speech and Language Therapy team. So it was the Let's Interact programme, which is adapted from the Hammond Learning Language and Loving It. It's a less time-intensive version. And 2 practitioners from each setting received 4 training sessions with group coaching, and practitioners received a minimum of 3 individual coaching sessions, which included getting feedback on a video of themselves interacting with a child, as well as reflecting on their own practice. Extra coaching sessions were offered if the SALT felt that they would benefit from these. So similar to the Hackney one, the intervention is usually delivered face-to-face, but training sessions were moved online during the lockdowns. Coaching started online, but was delayed until after the training because of technical issues with sharing videos. And so it was offered face-to-face from spring onwards. The implementation and process evaluation explored how the 2 interventions were delivered, any potential impacts, and factors to consider for a wider rollout of these interventions. So today we will focus on the perceived impacts, as well as any specific challenges and enablers for delivering CPD in PVI settings. The implementation and process evaluation included 3 workshops to develop theory of change models for each intervention with the SALT teams, case studies and interviews with the early starter group, and there was also an online survey with practitioners across both the early and late starter groups. As with the delivery of the interventions, in-person case studies and workshops were changed to virtual meetings online or phone calls. I will now pass over to my colleague Livy to discuss the findings. Sorry, Livy, you're on mute.
So Claire, is it okay if you present the slides for this? Yes, okay, thank you. So yeah, overall we found that managers and practitioners were very positive about the impact of the programme on the practice and wider setting. So most practitioners felt that they had become more skilled, confident and motivated to support children's language and communication development. So they reported having more knowledge and awareness of individual children's language, which meant they were then better able to identify gaps and then tailor their strategies to individual children. So overall, practitioners felt they're being more responsive and agile in their approach. And this approach included using more strategies which enabled their interactions to be child-led, for example, balancing the number of comments and questions used in interaction, and also owling, which was mentioned a lot, which is a strategy where practitioners are encouraged to observe, wait, and listen when talking to a child to elicit more of a response. So overall, practitioners were slowing down, being more patient, especially with children who were particularly shy or had English as an additional language. And the changes to the setting environment were limited due to COVID restrictions, but practitioners did share their learning and resources with other parts of the setting, including the Alan the Alien puppet and posters. And they said that the strategies and activities were actually being used with children of other age groups in the setting successfully as well. Grab the next slide, please. Thank you. So when reflecting on the key impact on children's language and communication skills, practitioners and managers felt that the pandemic had mixed impact, so it had negatively impacted some children, but others were actually at an expected or even higher level. And both of the programs appeared to be universal interventions, which practitioners felt supported the language of all the children at their settings, but they were particularly useful for targeting children who were struggling or had speech, language and communication needs. In Nottinghamshire, for example, there were cases where children who had been struggling initially became more responsive and using more words and even sentences, as well as quieter children becoming more confident and opening up. And this in turn affected personal, social and emotional development. For example, some practitioners observed that interactions between children tended to be calmer, increased turn taking and verbal negotiation, instead of just taking toys from each other, which could lead to conflict. And practitioners also reported children displaying greater confidence talking to adults and were giving more of their attention. So we have some key considerations which came up based on the findings in the study, which should be sort of taken into account when working with the PBI sector in particular. So first of all, earlier settings operate with strict staff-child ratios. In the context of COVID, staffing shortages were extra challenging because there were more staff absences due to illness and isolation, but also the need for bubbles, which could be at room level, but also sometimes in small groups. And so it's made it difficult for staff to be transferred between bubbles to cover for each other. So when arranging visits to a setting, it would be helpful to liaise with setting managers to make sure that visits are fit around timetables and avoid disruption. And if possible, budget should also be given for staff cover. And this would also help with issues of time scarcity. So a number of staff highlighted not having enough time in the working day to take part in the programme. And also because they're sort of providing care for children across a full working day, there isn't really much time when staff are not with the children and are available to meet or train as a group. Also, because of the pandemic, as we mentioned, training coaching programs were adapted from delivery from in-person to online. However, PBI settings may not actually have the technology needed to engage with online learning, so they may not even have laptops or tablets or even a stable internet connection. So one possible approach here could be to provide technology to settings where needed. Also, since the practitioners typically spend most of their time engaging with the children, they might not be familiar with technology and have limited IT skills. And further to this, practitioners may not have a work email address. So that's something to bear in mind when contacting participants for research. Staff also didn't seem to have access to any IT support. And typically, if they did have technical issues, they would be going to their colleagues or the speech and language therapy teams for support. Another consideration is lack of room capacity. So PBI settings may not have an extra room available for training or coaching sessions. Some in the study reported that the nursery manager's office was used as a staff room and a training room. So when training and coaching is taking place in that room, this then affects other staff in the setting, as well as the quality of coaching if there's lots of interruptions. So to reduce pressure on room capacity, sessions could be delivered at another venue that's local or easily accessible to the setting. Some settings did report small resource costs. So preparing and providing materials and resources can help to reduce these costs and also is useful for helping to disseminate learning. So at settings where the speech and language therapist helped with preparing things in advance, for example, with printing, laminating, practitioners did feel this alleviated their burden, especially for those who said they had little time in the working day for the programme. Practitioners referred to receiving support from managers, colleagues, and speech and language therapists, which was essential to help them participate in the programme, as well as to share and implement their learning across the setting. For example, staff were very highly praised the speech and language therapists for their expertise and also just their approachability for the ad hoc support. So in conclusion, CPD interventions do need to take into account the particular needs and challenges experienced by PBIs, especially compared with maintained settings, which tend to be better resourced. What works in a school setting, for example, may not work in a PBI setting and may need to be adapted to make it more suitable. PVIs do have a large number of disadvantaged children, and staff do tend to be less qualified. So they really could benefit from good quality and targeted CPD. However, they can face practical and budgetary challenges to achieving this and disseminating knowledge in the setting. High staff turnover as well in PVIs can make embedding and sustaining learning at a setting difficult. However, as I mentioned, support from senior staff and speech and language therapists is an important enabler to learning. And in this study, practitioners felt that the training and strategies they learned helped them to best support the children they worked with, which could benefit disadvantaged children at all levels. Both of the speech and language therapy teams in this study delivered universal interventions aimed to support all students. However, both teams identified that closing language and communication gaps were a long-term outcome in their theory of change models. So they could consider focusing on this more in future delivery.
Thanks a lot, Olivia, and thanks a lot, Claire. That was very smooth, especially compared to the the early teething problems. So I think it is worth highlighting that. That was really good. Thank you. We're now coming to the final presentation of this session. Emily Blackshow is going to talk about the evaluation of Coram Beanstalk's reading support programs for primary school children. Emily is a lead quantitative analyst at Coram. Emily, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to do my best. All the screens are kind of blowing my mind slightly. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully people online can see that now. So yeah, as Jonah said, I'm the lead quantitative analyst at Coram. We are a children's charity working to support the UK's most vulnerable children and young people and families. We are based at Coram campus. We're kind of a large group of smaller specialist charities. If you want to hear more about us, there's a really nice the Foundling Museum. We're just off of Russell Square. It would be a nice day out. And so today I'm going to be talking about Coram Beanstalk, which is a part of the Coram group who train volunteers to support children with their reading, and their focus really is on reading for pleasure and encouraging that in children. And they've been doing their work with volunteers for over 45 years now. So I'm in the impact and evaluation team at Coram, and we kind of evaluate internal work that the Coram charity group does, but also external projects. So this is an example of one of our internal projects. Next slide. So yeah, like I said, Coram Beanstalk supports children in primary schools on a one-to-one basis. So it trains up volunteers to provide support in schools, but outside of the classroom, to children who are identified by teachers and school staff as needing extra one-to-one time to support them with their reading. So they do this by identifying children who are below their expected level in terms of their reading attainment. If the child seems to have low confidence in themselves and their reading ability, and even things like choosing books, showing an interest in reading. And also if the child lacks opportunities and support outside of the school environment. School teachers and other school staff will often refer those children into the programme. And up on the screen there, I've got part of Coram's Beanstalk's theory of change. And so the end and ultimate goal really of Coram Beanstalk is to improve children's lives through reading support so that their risk of long-term disadvantage and the negative consequences of illiteracy are reduced. And they do this through two programs. So the main program is Reading 321, where Beanstalk volunteers support children twice a week, so 2 hours, and they do that for 3 terms, hence the 321, and it's one-to-one. But there is also Once Reading, where as in the name, volunteers just go in once a week to support children rather than twice. So this evaluation is essentially looking at whether there is a difference between outcomes for children who are supported once a week or twice a week. So it's effectively kind of a dosage evaluation. So we compared both programs. It wasn't a randomized study, so we were just using the reading records that are collected routinely as part of the Beanstalk service, as well as some additional surveys and interviews. So the main things that we were looking at was pre to post program change in terms of reading attainment, but also a few other measures. So confidence, enjoyment, and emotional well-being. Trying to keep up with my notes here. So it was a mixed methods evaluation. I'm the quant lead at Coram, so I can answer any of those questions a bit better than I can about the qual stuff. If you do have any questions about the qual, I can pass you on to Hannah, who'd be able to help. So we had quite a good sort of foundation for our research. We had 1,220 reading records from children who took part in the project. They were taken from the academic year 2018 to 19. We had a lot of disruption, obviously, with COVID when schools were shut. We also interviewed 8 Beanstalk volunteers, and we put out an online survey through the Coram Beanstalk newsletter, and we had 293 responses to that. Now, the vast majority, so the blueprint for Coram Beanstalk is the reading 321. So the vast majority of reading records were from children taking part in that, and a far smaller number of children taking part in once reading. And as it wasn't randomized, the first thing we wanted to do was to have a look at how well those 2 groups compared, the 2 groups of children taking part in the different programs. So obviously the once reading sample was far smaller, very similar in terms of gender split, similar in terms of how long the volunteers had volunteered with Coram Beanstalk, the age of volunteers, so the most common age group was 66 to 75. Often Coram Beanstalk's volunteers are retired and are giving us their time. And also in terms of the regional distribution of the programs, I've got a graph up there which shows the kind of spread of the volunteers and the different programs. We are looking to do a bit more of an in-depth mapping exercise. So if anyone has any good code or programs to try and do that, that would be great. In terms of the differences between the 2 groups, so children in reading 321 were younger, significantly so. Children in once reading were slightly older. Children in 321 also attended the program for longer. So they attended the reading support program for 22 weeks compared to 20 weeks, and that was significant as well. In terms of the levels of deprivation, using the index of multiple deprivation, children in once reading were from areas with higher levels of deprivation compared to children who were reading that support twice a week. So we felt that we were able to do a comparison between the 2 programs. Obviously, we would have loved it to be randomized, but that would be a bit tricky. And we did try and build some steps into our analysis, which I'll show you, to try and account for some of those differences between the 2 groups. So first we looked at whether the children from the 2 groups are starting from the same point. We found that children in once reading had higher levels of pre-program attainment compared to children in 321. You can see that on that slide there. It's a bit tricky. So the reading records work, it uses an ordinal scale rather than anything kind of interval or ratio, which made the analysis a little bit tricky. So essentially children are rated by their school teachers or school support staff as being below, working towards, at or above their expected reading level. And then those categories are broken down even further by being emerging or secure within those categories. So yeah, children in once reading were slightly higher in terms of reading attainment at the start of the program. So we knew we needed to adjust for that and really look at that pre-post difference. And we found that there wasn't a difference in the amount of change in terms of reading attainment. You can see that in the box plot on the screen, or you can try and visualize it as I'm explaining it. So we had 931 matched reading records, and all of the children, almost all of the children made improvements in terms of their reading attainment. So 73, just over 73% made improvements in terms of their reading attainment. This is across both programs, and about 20% remained the same. And it was a small, very small number of children whose level of reading attainment worsened over the course of the programs. So yeah, there wasn't a statistically significant difference between the two programs. It was a bit tricky how we kind of came to that conclusion just because of the nature of the data. So we're really lucky at Coram. We've got a kind of pool of volunteer statisticians that I sort of just throw questions at when I get stuck, and they really help me with this analysis. So I'll just skip forward and then come back. So we did do a Mann-Whitney U test on the amount of difference between from pre to post, and looking at that difference between the two programs. And that was non-significant. So there was a similar amount of change across both the programs. But then one of our statisticians also recommended that I did a repeated measures proportional odds logistic regression, which I've never done before. And that was so that we could incorporate the role of those predictor variables. So baseline reading attainment, also the things that the two programs differed in terms of, so things like program duration, that we could incorporate those in as variables into the model. And those results really did support the conclusions of the Mann-Whitney, so we felt quite confident in what we found. So the interaction between time point and score wasn't significant when those predictors were incorporated into that model. But yeah, the research obviously was observational, it wasn't randomized, so it doesn't allow the most confident conclusions on causality, but we feel like we really did interrogate the data to the best of our ability. It should also be noted that the sample size for once reading was small compared to the reading 321. Now I'm going to go backwards. So we also looked at confidence, enjoyment and well-being. So that's built in as part of the reading records. So with the reading attainment, the teachers and school staff complete that in terms of a child's reading attainment, but the confidence, enjoyment and well-being measures are kind of statements. So things like, I'm confident when choosing books with my reading helper, I'm able to concentrate in my sessions, and about maintaining a positive attitude. So either children can fill that in on their own, or they tell the reading support volunteer, and the reading support volunteer reports that. So it was a slightly smaller sample for this. So we had up to 388 responses to these questions. And again, there wasn't a statistically significant difference between the between the two programs at the start in terms of these variables. And children seemed to make similar improvements between the two programs. We also did some qualitative research. So we did a survey, and there's a really nice word cloud here. So our Beanstalk volunteers responded and provided some words that helped to describe their experience of taking part in this program. So we've got things like challenging, rewarding, interesting, uplifting. And they were, overwhelmingly positive. There are a few neutral or negative words in there as well, things like it being a mixed bag, it being frustrating and difficult, and also tiring and chaotic. So the volunteers who responded to our survey were mostly women and were mostly older adults, which is consistent with the general pool of Beanstalk volunteers. And the majority of people who responded to the survey volunteered with Beanstalk twice a week. It turned out that the people who, in the way that they responded, people who volunteered twice a week felt that that was the right amount of support to be able to support their children they were volunteering with well, to build rapport. But people who were volunteering once a week also felt that they were able to build rapport just with that once a week session, and often would say things about not being able to, they wouldn't have been able to do it otherwise if it wasn't offered at that once a week level. And we also did interviews with 8 Beanstalk volunteers, and volunteers were overwhelmingly positive about their experiences, also talking about how personally the experience of volunteering gave their week a sense of structure, something to look forward to, and doing something worthwhile for their community. Again, people who volunteered twice a week thought that worked best for them, once a week thought that worked best for them. And there's a few things that I think they reported on for Coram Beanstalk to try and improve more regular communication, building a sense of community amongst the volunteers. Yeah, so just moving on to our conclusion. So the main finding from our analysis, together with those responses to the survey and the interviews, is in favour of offering both reading support patterns, but we do want to do more rigorous evaluation. So yeah, with post-pandemic learning losses, reading losses, particularly those losses seeming to be larger for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, we really want to, our main recommendation to Coram Beanstalk was to continue offering that once a week volunteering opportunity in order to reach greater numbers of children, and also recruit volunteers who have less flexibility when it comes to their time and volunteering, and also might help to kind of diversify the pool of volunteers that Coram Beanstalk can attract if they really promote that once a week offer. So yeah, in terms of further research, we are looking to to kind of understand if there are any potential barriers to the twice weekly volunteering, particularly in more deprived areas, and also exploring ways with Coram Beanstalk to try to diversify their pool of volunteers. So thank you to all of the Coram Beanstalk volunteers who completed the surveys, and also thank you to our pool of statisticians. This would have been impossible without you. And if you have any questions, please come and find me. I know about this research. I don't know too much about Coram Beanstalk's actual service. We try and keep a bit of a healthy distance from them as the impact and evaluation team, but I can pass any questions on to Amy Lewis, who's the head of service, if you have any questions about that. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Emily. And also thanks a lot to all the presenters also for sticking to time. It makes my job a lot easier. We've got around 5 minutes for Q&A. Initially, I said 10, but we've got 5. It'd be good to start with questions from the floor. We've had 4 really fascinating presentations. Are there any questions? Maybe we'll start with 2. If there are 2 questions, or you go first. Yeah.
My question is for Rachel. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned about use of IT to help EAL learners. Were there any other standout pedagogical approaches that you found either in your research or as part of the Bell Foundation's work?
I'll just repeat that for the audience online. So the question from a member of the audience is if there were any standout pedagogical approaches that Rachel found in her research.
And in the pandemic, from the There we go. I'll repeat myself for the online audience. In the survey, the teachers who responded said that in the second lockdown, some of the schools actually reclassified all their EAL pupils as disadvantaged, so they were able to attend in person. So I think the teachers' response to that would be that was the best way to handle it during lockdowns. Of course, more generally, with schools being opened, there is a wealth of great pedagogy out there, and please do visit the Bell Foundation's website if you want details of any of that. But yeah, in lockdowns, I think opening up the schools that chose to do that was great. Yeah, it's a really...
Sorry, Rachel. Do you mind? You can repeat if you repeat the question.
Yeah. So no, repeat the question. You can.
Okay. No, the question was from a member of the audience whether there's any research on what an audience member described as a dual loss, so children not being encouraged to speak their home language as well as losing out on some of their English skills, as I understand.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, that is a problem, because even though there's this myth that the first use of the first language will hinder the development of English and the development of their subject learning, actually the evidence shows the opposite, that the more you preserve the first language, the quicker and the better they will learn widely. That includes English, that includes subject learning. So yes, absolutely. Even though these schools that are banning the first language think they're helping, they are hindering both. They're hindering the development of their general subject learning. They're hindering their development of English ultimately, and of course the negative impact for their own cultures and their own communications within their families is very, very disturbing. So very much, if you're following the evidence, you need to be really promoting the use of home language as well as sort of developing their English language skills. They are not in combat like people think. They are complementary.
Great, thanks a lot, Rachel. I think we'll stop it here. It's 11:55. Can I just say once again, thank you so much to the presenters who delivered some really interesting presentations in circumstances that I guess could have been better. So I just want to apologize for that, and also thanks a lot to the audience online as well as here for being so patient. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Apologies for the delayed start. We were getting our microphones and sounds all hooked up so that we could all hear each other. This is the second parallel panel session of today on social mobility and young people, and I'm joined by a very exciting panel to share their research. So we are going to go through all 4 presentations first. Each one will last 15 minutes, and then there'll be time for a short Q&A at the end of the session, at the end of everyone's presentations. So do hold your questions for them. And to start, I'd like to introduce Michelle Udo and Padmini Iyer, and they're joining us from Making the Leap and are going to present on advancing social mobility and evaluating impact and findings from Making the Leap. Okay, so unmute here and start again.
Okay. That's it. Okay. Can everyone on Zoom hear us? Yes, on slides. Great. Morning, everyone. So my name is Padmini. I'm the head of research and advocacy at Making the Leap, and I know lots of you from my time here at NatCen. I'm here with my colleague Michelle, who is the evaluation and impact officer at Making the Leap. And together we are the research team at Making the Leap, which is a grassroots social justice charity. We're a pretty recent addition to the organisation. I joined last September and Michelle joined in March. So in our presentation, I'm going to start off with an introduction to Making the Leap, tell you a bit about what we do, and then I'll hand over to Michelle, who'll talk you through findings from our current impact reports. And then at the end, I will talk you through some next steps for us as an evaluation team and pose some questions for you to reflect on for the discussion time. Okay, so as I mentioned, Making the Leap is a grassroots social justice charity. We were founded in 1993 and we're based in Brent, but we work across London. We have 20 full-time staff currently, and our mission is up there on the slide. So it's to transform the futures of less advantaged young people in the UK by providing training to raise their aspirations and develop their skills and confidence to choose and succeed in a career. So since this session is all about social mobility, we wanted to start it by sharing our definition. So Making the Leap, we see the goal of social mobility as firstly, a good standard of living, no matter what your occupation or background. So this includes, but it's not limited to, decent housing, the ability to feed yourself and your family, and financial security. Secondly, we see social mobility as about equality of opportunity, no matter what your parents' occupation or background. So this means fair access to education and training opportunities and employment opportunities in any sector. So how does Making the Leap work to make this a reality? Well, we have a range of programs that we deliver in mainstream schools, in mainstream secondary schools and pupil referral units. And we also work with young adults aged 18 to 30, and our flagship program with young adults is our ACE workshop, which is a 3-week program that runs every month. So through these programs, we aim to develop young people's soft skills, including confidence, communication, motivation, and teamwork. We aim to equip young people with practical skills, so including tailoring CVs, developing effective job applications and interview techniques. And we also aim to bridge the gap between school and work through insight days and work experience with employers. We also aim to inform young people about a wide range of careers and offer ongoing support, particularly for our young adults. So we support them into employment, and then once they're in work, we provide ongoing mentoring, pastoral support and career coaching. But we know that working with young people is just one side of the coin. So we also work with employers. We do this by celebrating organisations that are advancing social mobility in the UK through the UK Social Mobility Awards, which Making the Leap founded in 2017. And we also work directly with employers to improve the work that they're doing to improve socioeconomic diversity, equity and inclusion in the workplace. So before I hand over to Michelle, I just wanted to give you an idea of what we do as a research team at a charity, for some of you that might not be so familiar. So as a team, we're responsible for communicating, or capturing and then communicating the work done by our amazing delivery team. So this kind of starts with defining what data we should collect, so designing evaluation frameworks, of course, theories of change, looking at outcome measures, and then designing our monitoring evaluation tools. We then collect monitoring evaluation data, whether that's attendance and dropout of participants, looking at their demographics, and also looking at outcomes both quantitatively and qualitatively. We then use our evidence to inform delivery, so by analysing the data we collect and producing internal and external reports. So all of this work is kind of what we're doing at the moment, or to inform future monitoring evaluation work. But one of our first tasks when we joined Making the Leap was to look back at data that had been collected before we joined in order to create our first ever impact report. So what is an impact report for a charity? Well, in the research and evaluation world, I'm sure you all know, impact typically brings to mind RCTs and effect sizes, but for a range of reasons, in the charity sector, we look at impact kind of more broadly, I guess. So thinking about who we're reaching and what are the benefits of our services. And an impact report is a really important kind of output for any charity, as it allows you to demonstrate what you do and why you do it. And for us at Making the Leap, that's really important to communicate to the people we exist to serve and our partners who fund our work. So with all of that in mind, I'll hand over to Michelle to tell you all about our latest impact report.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to be talking about our annual impact report, which covers data from April 2021 to March 2022. So a key part of our process was mapping and understanding data that already existed, and supplementing that by collecting further new data. So here are our 3 evaluation dimensions. So the first one is reach, and to assess the reach of Making the Leap's engagement in delivery, use any data that recorded the number of demographics of schools and young adults involved in Making the Leap services, for example, attendance registers. The second one is experiences, as we believe that understanding the thoughts and opinions of young people is vital to informing the development of our services. So for this, we use data such as feedback surveys, testimonials, and qualitative interviews. And finally, to assess the effectiveness of Making the Leap activities, we use data that recorded the number of participants who achieved outcomes, such as soft skills and employment. This data came from sources such as self-report surveys. So Making the Leap's work in schools is incredibly multifaceted. So as well as running school events such as mock interview days and career fairs, the team also delivers a range of tailored sessions that expose students to the soft skills and behaviours needed to succeed in and beyond school. So over the past year, we engaged 2,277 students across 17 schools. In these 17 schools, we found that on average, 47% of pupils were eligible for free school meals. And this is compared to an average of 27.7% in English mainstream schools. Similarly, on average, 49% of pupils had English as an additional language, and this is compared to an average of 16.9% in English mainstream schools. So, an example of our delivery with schools is the Career Ahead program, which looks to empower and support students who are at risk of not being education, employment, or training after their final GCSE year. So overall, 50 students from across 8 schools have taken part in the program. Out of these students, 53% of them were female, half of them were eligible for free school meals, and 60% of them identified as Black or Black British. Out of the students that took part, Capital hosted 18 students from 2 schools for a week of work experience. On their last day at Capital, we asked these students to complete a short online feedback survey, which allowed us to understand their experiences. As shown by the quotes on the screen, many of the students felt that the sessions provided useful insights that informed their career decisions. They also noted that they developed a deep understanding of the soft skills needed in the workplace. As part of the same online feedback survey, students were also asked questions that allowed us to evaluate outcomes of the work experience. So in response to the first statement, which is I can imagine myself working somewhere at Capital, 61% of students agreed or strongly agreed. Response to the second statement, which is I have a good understanding of how to apply for jobs at Capital, showed that over half of the students felt that they gained practical knowledge about the job application process. And finally, 83% of the students said that they felt welcome in the workplace environment such as Capital's. So now I'm going to talk about our work with young adults, which primarily consists of the ACE workshop. So over the past year, 103 young adults attended the ACE workshop. 65% of them were male and 92% of them were from a racially minoritized background. All of the young adults have indicators of socioeconomic disadvantage, such as coming from a single parent family, having employed parents, or being eligible for free school meals. 61% of them had 1 to 2 indicators, while the rest had 3 to 5. So between the months of May and June this year, we interviewed 7 of the young adults who have participated in the workshop. As shown by the quotes on the screen, many of them discussed how the professional development had benefited from the knowledge and skills that they gained in the workshop. These interviews also explored the personal impact that the workshop had on these young adults. As a result of the pastoral and professional support they received, many of them said that they felt more positive about themselves and their career ambitions. Overall, 100 out of 103 young adults completed an ACE workshop, and 85% are now in education, employment, or training. Out of these 85, 53 are in employment, 35 are in training, and the remaining 12 are in a combination of the 3 outcomes. Thank you for listening, and I will now hand over back to you.
Thanks, Michelle. So before we finish, I'll just talk you through a few next steps that we'll be doing as a research team. So in addition to the findings that Michelle presented, we're also going to be looking at the data from the past year to understand any lessons for delivery. So we'll be looking at those recommendations with our delivery team to inform ongoing improvements to our services. We'll also be looking at our internal evaluation and impact work. So particularly important is to develop quantitative outcome measures for our different programs, and also to refine our data collection processes. We really want to strike a balance between kind of robust ongoing evaluation data while not putting too much of a research burden on our delivery teams and on the young people who take part in our services. Then lastly, we'll be publishing our impact report, that should be in September, which is a really important stage, as I mentioned, for any charity to help us demonstrate the reach and impact that we have, and particularly to share with our current and potential funders and partners. So just finally, on our last slide, we put up some kind of questions. Of course, we're really interested to hear any other questions or reflections you have during the discussion. But a few things that we're always reflecting on and would be great to get feedback on would be this question I mentioned about that balance between collecting ongoing evaluation data that is robust and kind of of rigorous, but also trying to avoid minimizing research burden on delivery teams and young people. Data collection in schools is another ongoing logistical challenge. Be great to discuss pros and cons of different methods on that. And also any thoughts that you have on anything that we might be missing within or beyond our evaluation dimensions, that would be great to hear. That is everything from us. Thank you so much for listening. Our contact details are up on the slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Padmini and Michelle. And I really appreciate the questions that you pointed at, that you posed to all of us at the end. And I'm sure we'll pick up those conversations in the breaks and at the drinks reception tonight. So moving on to our next speaker, we have Angus Holford from University of Essex. He's here to present on opening the black box of inequalities in university applications and outcomes. And can I ask that you please make sure to speak up? We have a very full room of the live audience, and we want to make sure that everyone can hear on Zoom.
I'll do my best.
Point. Okay, this piece of work is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and it's based on an analysis of anonymous data on the population of applicants to the University and College Admission Service centralised applications process and the applications they made. It's summarised in an explainer we've already published and is available online, and the link to that is on the screen and will be on the slides when they're circulated. Okay. So as we all know, there's many stages of the university application process, and these unfold over at least a couple of years prior to students arriving at university. And students, schools and universities all have some control over some of these stages, but not over others. So for example, it's teachers that predict students' grades, students decide where to apply, universities make the offer decisions, and then it's largely determined by students' exam results, whether the people get accepted or not on A-level, Highers, BTEC results day. So every single one of these stages can potentially contribute to the inequalities in the final outcomes by SES or ethnicity. Whether we think of this in terms of being accepted at university somewhere, at an elite university, or the competitiveness of the course in particular. And the point of this piece of work is to show the gaps in these outcomes by ethnicity and socioeconomic background at each of these stages, also controlling for other demographic characteristics, school characteristics, plus also all the decisions and educational track choices and outcomes of the process that have been made up to that point. So the idea is this should help tell us at which stages contribute most to these gaps in the final access, and therefore where we should try and intervene to narrow them. And we all also know that in 2020, COVID-19 school closures, the move to algorithm, and then school assessed grades shook up the process, particularly on results day, and there were limited places left in clearing. So I'm going to say a little bit about who was affected most by those changes. Before the application process even begins, of course, there's people's GCSE results, then their choice of where they're going to study and what they're going to study in further education. And, all of these decisions, by and large, or outcomes, put low SES and particularly Black ethnic minority students at a disadvantage relative to white. So for the rest of this talk, I'll be showing lots of graphs that look a bit like this, where the magnitude of the bars is regression coefficients controlling for lots of other demographics and prior educational performance. If we look at the low SES, high SES one here, This essentially shows that between 2017 and 2019, a low SES student was about 9 percentage points less likely to be taking at least one A-level than a high SES student with the same GCSE results and other demographics, etc. This gap narrowed a little bit in 2020, the purple bar, and the purple bars is where later in the process we might expect to start seeing some differences driven by COVID. And I could have shown you very similar graphs related to sort of taking a facilitating subject at A-level or the actual grades from people's GCSEs earlier on. So, before anything in the application process, it's important to recognise the need for improved resourcing earlier in the school system and to improve information, advice and guidance on prerequisites and facilitating subjects so students do not close off opportunities even when making decisions at age 16. So the next stage is predicted grades, which are supplied by the teachers. So here, just focusing on the darker bars, which have all the controls, this shows that low SES students and Black students receiving predicted grades equivalent to about half an A-level grade lower in one subject than high SES and white students, respectively. South Asian students by 2020 were performing slightly better in terms of these predicted grades. And for low SES students, at least, this gap is compounded by making what I'm calling here less ambitious applications. So by ambitious here, I'm referring to the gap between the entry tariff of a marginal student on the same course last year and the predicted tariff of this particular student this year. So low SES students are making less ambitious applications relative to their predicted grades than high SES. Black students slightly more ambitious. South Asian students were already substantially more ambitious, and this is driven substantially by a preference for medicine and dentistry courses. Now, the next stage is whether people receive an offer, and that difference in ambition we saw in the earlier stage makes it really important to compare like with like. So here we're not only controlling for other demographics and prior educational performance, but we're comparing students who are applying for the same course at the same university in the same year. So it's the pool that one group of admissions tutors is looking at. And here we find that low SES students are about 1 percentage point less likely to receive an offer than high SES. Black students, the gap has been narrowing, but was still about 2 percentage points in 2020 and slightly smaller than that for South Asian students. Now, there's a number of possible explanations for this, all of which require some more research and possibly data that we don't have access to. One of these is whether there's a deficit in the quality of the references or the personal statements that these students are supplying with their applications. And this is something that can be, needs to be addressed at the school level. If there is outright discrimination going on, UCAS has previously run a pilot of masking applicants' names to admissions tutors, and this could possibly make a difference to closing those gaps. Another possibility is, as lots of widening participation initiatives are based on school level characteristics rather than individual level, whether some non-disadvantaged students in schools that happen to be part of widening participation initiatives are somehow given an advantage over some disadvantaged students in schools that just miss out on that designation. Okay. And another thing that we need to work on a bit more within this data set is whether we properly accounted for the number of whether students have taken the right set of prerequisite subjects for the courses they're applying for. And again, that goes back to the need for information, advice and guidance at the school level. But the stage that seems to make really the biggest difference for access to university comes between receiving an offer and making the firm choice, and then being allocated or not to your firm or insurance choice on results day. So again, in these graphs, I'm comparing students who are holding a firm choice at the same course at the same university in the same year. And Black students are almost 8 percentage points less likely to be accepted on results day. South Asian students, that gap is widening and is around 9 percentage points. This is substantially due, other work has shown, substantially due to these groups underperforming relative to their predicted grades. So we need to intervene to help convert predicted into realised grades for these groups. But it's also important to notice that this gap didn't actually change very much at all in 2020. So whatever the sort of shaking up of results and allocations at an individual level, on aggregate, as far as this outcome is concerned, it didn't systematically disadvantage any of these groups in terms of access to university on results day. But there is another stage to the process, which is clearing. And the good news is that in usual years, ethnic minority students make very good use of clearing, and it's highly effective in finding a place at university if they've missed out on something on results day. The bad news is that in 2020, a combination of the grade inflation, fewer people wanting to take a year out, this resulted in many fewer places being left unfilled, and this hindered their ability to make up for being less likely to be accepted on results day. Another possibility is that uniquely in 2020, admissions officers making these decisions are looking at predicted rather than achieved grades, and this may introduce more discretion to the problem. I think it's important to point this out because the centre assessed grades that were the final solution to exam cancellations were publicly accepted as a sort of fair solution, and this analysis does show that they still harmed ethnic minority prospects relative to white students. But overall, you know, the main part of the process that's leads to gaps in university access is definitely this being less likely to be accepted onto the firm choice on results day. So thinking about possible reforms to the university applications process, it would be good to possibly reduce the reliance on clearing. And this could come in a number of ways. One is allowing a much longer ranking of courses which students hold offers for, and students then go to the highest one they meet the conditions for. Very few people end up actually using their insurance choice. So some sort of nudge in the application system to encourage a safe bet application that could possibly influence how variable results are compared to predictions. That could help, or something maybe more prescriptive could restrict students in their combinations of their applications. So it's already the case that you can't apply to both Oxford and Cambridge at the same time. You can't apply to 5 medicine courses in the same year because there's a very probable chance of ending up with no offer. So there could be a reason to extend this to you can't apply for 5 courses at very high tariff courses, universities. Finally, there's always discussion about the possibility of introducing a post-qualification applications or offers system, and this would reduce the reliance on or the impact of clearing, but it certainly wouldn't reduce the gaps that are due to the deficit in age 18 attainment, and they're still very much the main thing that's resulting in these gaps in access to university and particularly high-ranking institutions. So yeah, that's all I've got to say, and likewise pleased to take questions, or love to hear if you've got other ideas about what maybe we haven't thought of at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angus. And continuing on the theme with university, I'm going to hand directly over to our next speaker, Elaine Drayton, who's joining us from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And her research asks which university degrees are best for intergenerational mobility.
Great, thanks very much. I'm excited to speak today and to contribute to what's already been a really good discussion. I'll be talking about a piece of work that's trying to look at the contributions of universities to intergenerational mobility. And the motivation for this comes out of the fact that we now have a lot of research that's showing that university has a positive effect on earnings. And that might suggest that it could provide a route up the income ladder for students from low-income backgrounds. But at the same time, we know that students from low-income backgrounds are less likely to go to university compared to richer students, and are much less likely to go to the most prestigious institutions. As a result, the contribution of universities to mobility is a bit ambiguous. So as I've said, most of the existing literature is looking separately at access to university for low-income students and the earning success that they experience. So in this piece of work, we're trying to bring together those strands and look at the overall contribution of universities to mobility. And we do that by calculating what we call mobility rates for universities. And these are the shares of students admitted who come from a low-income background and who move up the income ladder. So I'll say a bit more on the specifics in a bit, but we're doing that for individual universities, subjects, and courses. So to do this, we're relying on a large administrative data set that many of you will probably be familiar with, the LEO data set. And this tells us information for all students about their background, which university they went to, what they studied, as well as their earnings outcomes. So to measure mobility, we need a measure of where someone has started out and then where they end up. So we don't directly observe parental income. So we use as a proxy for low income whether the student was eligible for free school meals. Then in terms of outcome, we focus on their earnings at age 30. And finally, we focus on students who would have attended university in the mid-2000s, and that's so that we can observe them at a late enough age to pick up their earnings at age 30. So in terms of defining our mobility rate, we construct this by taking the product of an access rate and a success rate. So the access rate is, for a university, the share of students who were on free school meals at school. The success rate is then the share of low-income students, FSM students, who make it into the top 20% of earners at age 30 amongst their cohort. The resulting statistic, the mobility rate, is then the share of students at a university who both come from a low-income background and who move up into the top 20% of earners. And we're doing this for individual universities, subjects, and courses. So I'll start by focusing on the findings for the universities. So to start off, this is looking at how accessible university is for low-income students. So on the vertical axis, we have our access rate, which is the share of students from an FSM background. And we're plotting the universities based on how academically selected they are. And we can see that there's a very clear relationship between access and selectivity. For instance, if you take the bottom right-hand cluster of dots that represents the Russell Group universities, they have very low shares of students from a free school meal background. And for example, over the period that we study, that if you take the bottom 3 universities, they had fewer than 1% of students who came from an FSM background. At the other end of the scale, you can see that other universities have very high shares of low-income students. So the less selective institutions can have up to 30% of their student body made up of FSM students. So then when we turn to the earning success of low-income students, the pattern is completely reversed. So now we're looking at the likelihood that an FSM student makes it into the top 20% of earners at age 30. So if we take the most selective institutions, low-income students who go there are much more likely to make it into the top of the earnings distribution compared to students who go to the less selective institutions. So together with the previous graph, this is telling us that low-income students who go to selective places are much more likely to do well in terms of earnings, but not many of them go there in the first place. And so it's not quite clear which type of university would be best for social mobility. And to answer that question, we then need to bring together these measures of access and success. So this looks a bit complicated, but hopefully I can walk you through it. So now we're plotting on the vertical axis our success rate, so the likelihood that low-income students make it to the top of the earnings distribution. And then on the horizontal axis, we have the share of students who come from FSM background. And as you move up and to the right, then we're increasing both the success rate and the access rate, therefore we're increasing our mobility rate. Then you probably don't have to pay too much attention to the downward sloping curves, but they're just plotting combinations of access and success that give the same mobility rate. So again, here we can see places that tend to have, universities that tend to have high success rates often have low access rates and vice versa. So for example, if you take the cluster of purple dots in the top left, that's the most selective Russell Group, which is LSE, Imperial and Oxbridge. These all have the highest rates of success for low-income students who go there, but because their access rates are much lower, they're not performing very well in terms of their overall contribution to mobility. So that said, there are a number of universities that buck this pattern and do quite well on both dimensions. These are low selectivity and mid selectivity institutions in the blue and in the red, and they are offering high access rates with around average success rates to deliver the highest mobility in the sector. We can then look a bit more closely into who are the top performers on mobility rates. So when we look at the type of universities that are performing best, with the exception of Queen Mary's, it's not the most selective institutions that are coming out top for mobility. Instead, it's the less selective and mid-ranking institutions that are both taking in a lot of low-income students and offering reasonable earnings prospects. It's also noticeable with this set that they're all based in major cities and particularly in London. So at this point, it's important to note that looking at these top performers, we can't say much about whether it's down to things that universities are doing themselves versus the type of students they're taking in versus their location. We have done a bit of work to try and adjust these success rates, these earnings, the likelihood that you make it into the top 20% of earnings for the characteristics of the students. And that only enhances the pattern that we see because less selective institutions are taking in less academically performing students in the first place. But there's still a lot to explore in terms of the role of location and what types of students they're taking in. So we can do the same exercise for subjects. So again, we've got our success rate on the vertical axis and the access rate on the horizontal. And amongst the subjects, it's pharmacology that's the standout performer. So in pharmacology, we find 4% of students both come from an FSM background and move into the top 20% of earners at age 30. We also find that computing, law, and business do quite well as they combine high access rates with around average success rates. Then in contrast, if we look at veterinary sciences, geography, and agriculture in the bottom left, they're some of the poorest performers, and they're only 0.5% of students are both from a low income background and reach the top of the earnings distribution. So our large data set also allows us to look into particular combinations of universities and subjects. So now each dot represents a specific subject at a specific university. And we can already see that there's a lot greater variation at this course level than we were seeing with subjects or universities. So here we've taken one example of an institution, the University of Manchester, and we've plotted the subjects that it offers. And we can see in this example, the courses have a similar level of access rates, but there's a lot of variability in terms of the success rate, depending on which subject you study. It's also notable that in this example, we have one course, computing, that's in the top 10% of courses for mobility. And at the same time, we have another course, technology, that's in the bottom 10% of courses. So even within one institution, there's a lot of variability, and that emphasizes the importance of thinking about policy at the course level. Then here we're just doing the same thing, but now we're highlighting a specific subject. So if we recall, pharmacology was quite a high performer in terms of mobility. And we can see that overall it's consistently performing quite well with all of its courses located in the top right. But as before, there's still a lot of important variation that we need to consider. And then finally, we take a look at how, I think I sent you a different set of slides. So we also look at how these mobility rates compare to traditional measures of value in higher education, namely earnings returns. And we look at the correlation between the university mobility rates that we've calculated and the average earnings returns that we've estimated for the universities. And we find that overall there's quite a low correlation between these mobility rates and the earnings returns. And there are examples of universities that actually have negative estimated earnings returns, but actually do quite well when you look at them in terms of mobility rates. And this suggests that we're picking up something distinct with this mobility measure that's not captured in the average earnings returns. So wrapping up, we've provided a comprehensive picture of mobility in higher education. And we find overall many courses do offer reasonable earnings prospects and take in a number of low-income students. However, there's a lot of variability both across institutions and within. We also find that it's not the most selective institutions who rank highest on mobility. Instead, it's the mid-ranking institutions that are both taking in a lot of low-income students and offering reasonable earnings prospects. And it's particularly those that are located in bigger cities. So the cohorts that we've looked at, they went to university in the 2000s, which is obviously quite a long time ago now. We've done some work to look at how higher education participation has changed in more recent years. And while there has been some progress, we don't think it's substantial enough to have changed the overall picture that we've seen today. And then finally, we hope that future work will be able to dig more into what are the drivers of these differences in mobility, to what extent it's something that universities are doing, and also what institutions can learn from each other in order to improve their contributions to social mobility. Great, thanks.
Thank you so much, Elaine. And for our final session, for our final speaker of this session, we have Emily Tanner, who's joining us from the Careers and Enterprise Company. And she's here to speak to us about the role of careers education in supporting disadvantaged young people's transitions.
Thank you very much. Just setting up my slides here. Is sound okay down the back? Great. Well, it's really nice to be back at NatCen. I'm very conscious that I'm standing between you and lunch, so after a big morning of lots and lots of talks. So thank you for your patience. Thanks for bearing with me. So when I saw the title of this conference about taking stock and finding solutions, I was really keen to bring the perspective of careers education, because I know that as we sort of emerge from COVID, a lot of focus in education policy has been around attainment, rightly so. But from my standpoint, and I'll say a bit more about that, really conscious of the need to balance this with the other skills and learning that we know are really important for young people as they make their transitions from school. So I'll say a bit more about what I mean by careers education. It's come up quite a lot this morning in different talks, but in a nutshell, it's about the engagement that young people have with employers right across secondary education. It's about their opportunities for one-to-one personal guidance and the way that they find out about careers and jobs through their curriculum learning. So a little bit about overview and context. So this paper brings together some perspectives from research, policy and practice. There are three things I'm going to try and do. One is to really consider the alignment of the careers education system we have to the needs of what we know about disadvantaged young people. Secondly, I want to look at challenges and opportunities in the careers system post-COVID. And then to share some of what's been going on around building evidence around targeted interventions. And in terms of context and perspective, my role is leading research at the Careers and Enterprise Company, which is a government-funded organisation that oversees careers education across England. And we don't deliver to young people directly, but what we do is support careers leaders, the key people within schools and colleges, to use evidence, data, resources, so that they can be tailoring provision to students, including the needs of disadvantaged young people. So to start off with then, I wanted to share with what we know from the evidence about the barriers that disadvantaged young people face when they're planning and making transitions. And this draws on an evidence review that the Behavioural Insights team carried out for us about a year ago. And has now underpinned a programme of interventions that we're evaluating. So for disadvantaged young people, really important to bear in mind that basic and current needs are often front of mind. So there may be more postponing and thinking about the future, perhaps making it harder to engage with careers education throughout secondary school. And then also where young people face lower attainment, it's also the case that on average they face more complex post-16 choices. So they're more likely to be considering vocational options, which are more likely to involve a change of institution. So you've got this burden of, perhaps struggling a bit more with GCSEs, but also having more complex choices to navigate as they're thinking and moving towards leaving school. In terms of opportunity barriers, social networks that are really helpful for finding out about careers, getting experience, finding information, are often more limited for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And when you put this in combination with what we know about stereotypical ideas shaped by gender and social class really setting in early, you can see that as a very active barrier around social mobility. And then motivation is also important. So career self-efficacy, which is that sense of having agency and confidence in achieving goals, can be lower. And then, of course, we have structural barriers, which we've covered quite a lot in this morning so far. So with all of that in mind, the careers education system that we have delivered through schools and colleges has real potential to act as a support to achieving social mobility. So the circles you see on the left are depicting the careers system in place, where each school and college has a careers leader, which is a role who coordinates all the provision, the engagement young people have with employers, using data and digital systems, this Compass Plus I'll mention a few times in the session. And then if we look at the wider circles, we've now got the majority of schools and colleges within a careers hub. So that's within a locality, bringing together education providers, employers with local skills agendas, and trying to match that all up to give young people the experiences that they need to shape their ideas in relation to how labour markets are changing. And then on the right-hand side here are the Gatsby benchmarks of good career guidance that were formed about 8 or so years ago, based on international evidence. And these are providing the framework for activities that young people are accessing through school and college. And at the heart of the Gatsby benchmarks is this idea that you're addressing the needs of each student. So recognising how context and preferences and skills need to drive the way that young people are engaging with information and careers related experiences as they go through education. So we've been monitoring the development of careers provision for the past 5 or 6 years through a tool called Compass. And careers leaders answer about 50 questions about their provision, and we report on the percentage of schools and colleges that are fully achieving each benchmark. So it's quite stretching. They have to do quite a lot of things in their provision to fully achieve the benchmark. And so using this data to look at the impact of COVID, if you look at the green bars, which was the data from the end of the last academic year, about a year ago now, you can see that the hardest hit aspect of careers provision was around employer engagement, so benchmarks 5 and 6. Benchmark 5, so encounters, which is things like careers fairs or career talks, it might be mentoring, was less hard hit. And that was really because employers and schools, colleges pivoted quite quickly to online provision. So it might have been that whereas previously an employer came in and gave an assembly or talked to a class, they were now doing that online. And we've heard from different angles, certainly from employers and from schools and colleges, about the benefits that that's had in terms of geographic reach and reach to more disadvantaged groups and more flexibility. So we expect that to be carrying on in that kind of hybrid fashion. But meaningful experiences of the workplace have been harder to pull off, as won't surprise you, it's harder virtually. There have been some really impressive examples. So there have been some large employers that have developed programs where they've set project-based tasks for students, and they've engaged quite a large number of students in two-way interaction. But I think most agree that it's not a match for what we think of as work experience in real life. So in terms of where we are now and considering the needs of students from disadvantaged backgrounds, I want to focus the rest of the presentation on 2 things really. One is a set of opportunities in the policy environment around the careers system for greater targeting, and then also what's going on with building new evidence through testing programs and evaluation. So it's been quite an amazing year of scrutiny for careers education, creating what really sort of feels like a moment of opportunity. So down the left-hand side is everything going on in the policy space concerning schools, SEND, levelling up. And there's been a focus in all of these papers around careers education. And then along the bottom, a raft of reports from organisations like the Sutton Trust, Teach First and so on, focusing in on careers education, really questioning what's working well, what needs to be improved, and lots of ideas coming out around that. On the right-hand side, I've tried to draw out some of the key themes of what we're seeing. And those are certainly a real agreement about greater focus on vocational routes. So this is largely through the demand side, increasing awareness amongst young people of what's going on, increasing opportunities for making applications, following through and so on. So that's really become centre stage, and some new legislation called the Provider Access legislation coming in, which means that young people right from the beginning of secondary need to be having regular encounters with providers of apprenticeship and technical education. Also a renewed emphasis on employers. So employers really driving the agenda, helping to shape curriculum. Starting early, so this idea that because ideas are shaped so young, that it's actually is quite a lot of consensus growing around the value of beginning in primary school. So the term careers education doesn't land so well in primary as you might imagine, but that idea of developing skills, not shutting down options, really having a sense of future possibilities from a really young age, and that's reflected in the school's white paper. And then a focus on disadvantage within a universal model comes through across the piece. But there's a lot of continuity for that Gatsby benchmark framework as a guiding framework, and for the rollout, there's a commitment to the rollout of careers hubs. So over the next couple of years, we should see every part of the country, all schools and colleges being at least having the offer of being part of the careers hub. And then teacher CPD comes up in various places. So the idea that although teachers aren't responsible for giving career guidance, they're having career conversations. They've got the opportunity to connect curriculum learning with future opportunities, local labour markets, and so on. So that's become quite a strong area of focus in this space as well. And then we're also seeing some opportunities sort of within the data. So this is looking at engagement with different aspects, different indicators of the career system according to quartiles based on FSM eligibility within schools. And if you look at the dark blue bars, we're seeing that the most disadvantaged quartile of schools is more likely to be in a careers hub at the moment. It's more likely to be using that digital tool Compass Plus, which allows targeting of students, understanding individual access to careers activities and so on. And then they're more likely to have a careers leader who's engaged in this formal training that's on offer now, which is coming through as associated with better quality provision. We're also seeing a similar sort of pattern around the actual quality of provision. So looking at the bottom 4 Gatsby benchmarks here on the slide, we can see that the most disadvantaged quartile of schools is more likely to be fully achieving each of those benchmarks. So that's about providing those encounters for students with employers, experiences of the workplace, getting the opportunity to meet providers of further and higher education, and personal guidance. So I think that's it's not necessarily telling us that the challenges are solved, but it's just providing an opportunity there for showing how young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds are accessing provision to a greater degree from the school perspective. And then I wanted to sort of just towards the end go back to the behavioural insights team review that they did for us down the left-hand side. The researchers drew out a set of principles from the evidence base that characterise effective interventions of career guidance for disadvantaged students. And so those are really forming the basis for some work going on at the moment. The first one is just making sure that there's that targeting of barriers. So you've got the overarching framework of provision, but that need to be deliberate in tailoring intervention to specific needs. So really looking at the barriers that you're trying to remove. Secondly, around repeat provision, so the idea that young people don't just need a one-off experience of something, but you need to have those multiple opportunities in order to shape ideas, choices, and so on, test things out. The influences are really important. We know that parents and carers are still the primary influence on the choices that young people make, and teachers are important. And that need to create social capital where you may not have it within your family and family networks. And then the principle of using data, evaluating robustly, which is, of course, music to my ears. And then on the right-hand side are 2 programmes of research that we've developed to respond to some of those principles and to try and build up the evidence. So the first is funded by an international bank and is focused specifically on effective transitions for young people from year 10 into post 16. The second is a set of 10 projects that are designed and delivered by Careers Hub. So really interesting. So we're seeing local areas really drive that innovation and testing. And those are the ones that I'm most closely involved with. I just pulled out 3 here as examples say a tiny bit about them. So the SEND Alumni Project in Leeds is creating a network within schools of young people who have SEND, who were at the school, who are now in employment, coming back into school and giving career talks and provision to young people to really help current young people with SEND, you know, understand, believe that they can have paid work as well in the future, and to build those connections. The project with Looked After Young People is building careers right into their personal education plans. So it just becomes a natural part of their process that they're having career conversations, and there's some continuity there for some who have quite transitory experiences. And then the teacher externship program in Thames Valley is an example of engaging influencers. So it's teachers spending 4 days in industry, learning about ways in which they can connect curriculum learning to real world examples, but also building their knowledge of pathways into scientific jobs, these are STEM, that they may not have thought about. They're different from their own, often university-led experience. So I'm just going to touch on this very briefly, that we've excitingly been developing some student data around career readiness. As we were developing the tool a couple of years ago, we had some really invaluable support from NatCen, question design experts. And this is now launched within that digital tool Compass Plus. So young people are reflecting on their career readiness skills. And we've got quite a lot of data amassing around that, which I think will be incredibly interesting as we go forwards, hearing about skills from a young person's perspective. And then finally, just a few words of summary. I think it's really, the point I wanted to get across is that disadvantaged young people really have the most to benefit from school and college delivered provision. And there's a system now in place, but with that need to be more deliberate, go deeper, really build that evidence around what works for different groups of young people. We've seen the impact of COVID on opportunities, and I think coming out of this, there's that opportunity to learn about more agile approaches to engaging with employers and to understand the impact of those. There's an opportunity now to support further targeting through all the policy focus, and for careers hubs to be driving a lot of that activity locally and meeting local skills needs through careers education. And then finally, I couldn't resist, you know, a call to the fact that we really need more research in this area. We're working on quite small scale pilot projects. We really need those to be scaled up to establish a much stronger evidence base around how to remove barriers around young people's transitions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you to all of our speakers. Thinking back to this morning's keynote, I thought that these presentations really spoke to the responsibility that we have to match and champion young people's ambitions in an equitable way. And so I hope that you found these presentations not just interesting, but also energizing. We can open the floor to some questions before we break for lunch. So does anyone have any questions for our presenters?
The gap between kind of offers and kids who met their offers, and that it didn't change much during the pandemic, when I thought there would be a kind of greater, a smaller gap between predictions and actual results, because the teachers were involved in results. And I just, anything to say about that, just struck me as quite odd, because you thought would be much more likely to predict, to give the child what they predicted for them.
And Angus, do you mind summarising the question before responding?
Okay, so the question was sort of a statement of curiosity about the gap staying roughly the same in 2020 in terms of what I called allocation after results day. Now, I should maybe clarify, so this is sort of after everything had come out in the wash in terms of people being allowed to appeal, go backwards and forwards, maybe initially allocated to their insurance and then went back to get their firm choice. So, you know, I think it shows there was a degree of discretion granted by universities, and the in practice, if lots of the variation was happening for people who either would have exceeded what they were aiming for anyway, or would have been far below what they were aiming for anyway. And teachers' decisions about these rankings did turn out on average to be right, even if for many students it was quite wrong. And yes, we were curious, we were intrigued and found it curious too, but yeah, in the end it didn't, acceptance rates went up by roughly the same amount for all the groups we investigated. Okay, so the question was about whether the disparity in offer rate may to some extent be reasonable because of a subsequent lower probability that the disadvantaged groups are going to meet the conditions of offers. So we can't tell with this data sort of what the factors determining what the decision was. We did suspect there may be a degree of sort of statistical discrimination in terms of what's the likelihood that this student with this predicted grades is going to actually achieve them, and that gets factored into the results. And that, as I said, may also be part of the explanation for why the relative advantage of ethnic minorities in clearing in 2020 was reduced, because then we're still looking at, to some extent, predicted grades rather than actually achieved ones. But even if I say, okay, this might be an explanation, I still think statistical discrimination on the basis of characteristics is still an aspect of discrimination that's putting those individual students at a disadvantage. Sorry. So there was a question about whether admissions tutors have access to ethnicity. I'm saying my understanding is they don't, apart from Oxford and Cambridge, where they ask for a photograph with your application. But at other places, possibly name blinding might make a difference.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question from the back, and then we'll break for lunch? Sarah, sorry.
Thank you. My question goes to Elaine. I was wondering how you and success, because you concluded, you said one, that high selectivity is not equal to high mobility. And I think the way you computed that, is there any other thing you would have expected apart from that?
Thanks. So I think the question was how do we measure, how do we capture intergenerational mobility, and also what the correlation between access and success. Yeah. So this work is focusing on intergenerational income mobility. We don't have a perfect measure of income in the data set that we use. So we use as a proxy for low income whether a child is eligible for free school meals. And over the period that we look at, that's capturing around 12.5% of the poorest students. So then that's trying to capture low income students. And then we focus on where they end up, and we focus on moving to the top of the income distribution. And so if these FSM students have moved into the top 20% of the income of the earnings distribution, we can say that they've moved up the earnings ladder because they started in the bottom 12.5%. So we are just focusing on kind of bottom to top mobility in this work in particular. And then in terms of access and success, I think what was quite stark is some of the universities that offer the highest earnings returns for students, so are high in terms of earning success, are really not letting in many low-income students in the first place. So often they have very low access. And so I think in general, there's this inverse relationship between the two, but we do also see some instances of universities where they've managed to do reasonably well on both.
Thank you so much, Elaine, and thank you all for your questions. We're going to break for lunch now, and I hope that these conversations can continue throughout the day.